Okay, so let's crack on. So good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the first Swansea University Annual Digital Forensics and Cybersecurity Symposium. For those who don't know me already, my name is Reza, and I'm a senior lecturer in cyber threats based in the School of Social Sciences. I'm also a member of Cyber Threats Research Center. So as you might be aware, the CyTREC and School of Social Sciences have jointly organized this symposium, which will be held every Tuesday over a 10-week period. So this symposium is a series of interdisciplinary research seminars that will focus on the presentations of new advances and research in the fields of digital forensics and cybersecurity. These seminars will be delivered by the leading experts in the fields of digital forensics and cybersecurity from both industry and academia, who have very kindly agreed to present in this symposium. Each seminar will last around 1 hour, including 20 to 40 minutes presentation by our guest speakers, and followed by 10 or 15 minutes of question and answers. I will be chairing these sessions, and all the seminars will be recorded. So if you prefer not to be recorded, please leave your cameras off. Our today's guest speaker of the series is Paul, who has very kindly given up his time to be with us today. So Stuart, Paul, on behalf of the CyTREC and the School of Social Sciences, I would like to welcome you to Swansea University, albeit virtually. So we look forward to your presentation. So without further ado, I pass on the session to you.
Brilliant. Thank you, Reza. I really appreciate it. And hello, everybody. If you're watching the recording, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, whichever time you decide to watch this as well. So, but yes, so I'm Paul Maskall. I'm the Fraud and Cybercrime Prevention Manager for the Dedicated Card and Payment Crime Unit, or the DCPCU. Unfortunately, as you well know, law enforcement, we do love our acronyms, doesn't necessarily roll off the tongue all that well. But yes, my little corner of the DCPCU is very much around the kind of prevention, education, and this kind of research element in order to how do we go about preventing the likes of fraud and cybercrime, social engineering, a lot more effectively than we do. Now, if you've seen the write-up for this presentation, it's very much, I'm quite cynical of how we go about it now. Generally speaking, from a law enforcement point of view, from a financial industry point of view, and from a general education point of view. Because by every possible metric, fraud being probably the biggest crime type in the UK by, well, quite a considerable margin, but also this whole aspect around understanding the changing nature of what crime is looking like and how it will go forward in relation to how we combat it, but also from a public point of view, and especially when we've got borderless crime that we have now in cyber-enabled fraud and increasing levels of this, is that we're not necessarily all doing all that well in preventing it. So how this came really about was essentially I was ex-law enforcement, so ex-police. I used to work in intelligence, counter-terrorism, and then I went into cybercrime and fraud. Now, in my job, the first iteration was the cybercrime and fraud was back in 2015. And what was very interesting to me is that I was trying to educate businesses and organizations and the public around preventing and protecting themselves against fraud and cybercrime. Now, I'd come from something very, very traditional with a network as old as time in relation to counterterrorism and traditional crime and intelligence. Now, but when I went into cyber is that people didn't care. Like people from a business point of view, from a public point of view, is that if I said to you, right, terrorism, this is a real big problem, exactly, you wouldn't like turn around to me and say, well, no, it's not a problem at all. It's something I completely ignore. But that's exactly what was happening with cyber and fraud, and it left me very confused. Now, the eternal academic in me led me down what has essentially become what is now nearly an 8-year rabbit hole for me in understanding the psychological aspects and, by extension, the cognitive heuristics around decision making, but how they frame themselves around our relationship with technology. Our relationship with technology, but by extension, again, how manipulation happens via the use of technology, and also how people conceive of risk. Now, that's why I'm here, and that's why I'm talking to you, but also why I'm actually within the DCPCU itself. Because the DCPCU is a very interesting police unit. We are an operational police unit, but we are funded directly via UK Finance and the Trade Association for the Financial Industry, and we are funded by the banks, and we look after and service the banks from an investigation point of view and also an education point of view. So we both have City of London police officers, we have metropolitan investigators as well, but also the fact is, like myself, I'm employed by UK Finance and I work within that collaborated and operational unit. Many people haven't actually heard of us because we are a funded unit, but it is our 20th anniversary this coming year. So I want a bit of food for thought on this basis and how all of this, I'm a great believer that fraud is much more of a symptom to our world's ills and society's ills than anything else, especially in relation to our changing relationship with technology. I'm a big believer that technology isn't necessarily the enemy, but our relationship with it certainly could do with some work. Now, on top of this is that I think that actually the changing nature of consumer behavior, the way in which we utilize our data and our money and our transfers, and again, how we communicate is part of this larger issue. So let me tell you, why is it objectively easier to part with, I don't know, £10 note that's in your purse, in your bag, in your wallet, than it is to part with probably 40, 50 pounds worth of contactless on your everyday shop? Now, most people say this to me, is that, again, well, why is it objectively easier? We might make a really horrible dad joke and say, oh, well, it's not real money, is it? Tap, and you're using your watch or you're using your phone, etc. But it's a lot easier to part with than it is to have that cash or something like that in your wallet. Now, on top of this, I'd also say that, again, from this, this has been more or less the case for thousands of years, is that if you go back far enough, you've got either fiat currency, so pounds, euros, dollars, whichever, gold, silver. I don't care what you're actually transferring. It could be a cow, it could be livestock, it could be anything that you're trading. But there is an intentionality around those transactions. And the fact is, when you're transferring money and when you're or you're making a payment in the store with something that you can hold in your hand, I would argue that, again, there's this intentional and emotive decision making and almost an unconscious trade-off around how you are trading what something that you are holding in your hand that you value versus what products, services, or something you are purchasing. Now, I would then, by extension, say that, well, now, in what, 14 years of smartphones, 14 years of contactless payments, near field communication, the changing nature of less than a decade and a half of smartphones or proper smartphones, etc., and this evolving nature in our relationship with technology, is that we are less intentional about our transactions around things that we're supposed to value. Now, what I would argue now is that we are probably much more akin to what is subconsciously detached habits in the way we transact our money, but also our data. So, for instance, if I give you an example, if you see somebody with a clipboard in your middle of your high street somewhere, what do? Now, I'm pretty sure it's either I want to completely avoid eye contact, I don't want to talk to them, or I'm going to have this massive semicircle around them, potentially even taking a different route to wherever I was going in order that I don't have to speak or engage with that person with a clipboard. Now, funny enough, if I stopped you, what would be the reasons as to why you didn't want to engage with them? Now, number one on that list is very often, I don't want to get spammed. I already give to charity, or I do all this, etc. There's some sort of myriad of excuses that we end up coming out of, but very often it's inconvenience. I am going somewhere, I am busy, I am doing something else, there's a trade-off, I don't want to spend the time and give this person my data so they don't spam my inbox, etc. Now, that is an intentional decision that you're avoiding that person because I perceive the data in which I'm giving. But actually, the data that we give online pretty much every minute of the day far, far exceeds that intentional decision that you made to avoid that person and making sure that you didn't have any eye contact with them. Is that this is the changing relationship around what it is that we're supposed to value. Now that's data, it's our money, it's that transactional relationship, is that we've gone from this intentional and emotive decision-making where it's that trade of something that we value, that we can hold, that we're biased to understand there is value behind, over to what is now more akin to subconscious detached habits. Online banking, for instance, again, from a fraud, cybercrime point of view, a scam, social engineering, authorized push payment fraud, all these sorts of things, is that now we can transfer our entire life savings at a touch of a button. And the thing is, from that value point of view, if you don't value something, then therefore you're not actually motivated to protect it. And this is the key issue around our data, is because we've been conditioned to give it away, especially in the last 2 decades. And this is the issue, is that this changing consumer behavior, even for instance, buying a product, buying something online, is that there used to be that trade-off. It's like, I need to go into the city, I need to travel to the shop, I need to go and do something, but actually the effort and the trade-off would most likely outweigh the need for the product. But now with Amazon and online deliveries, etc., we don't need that trade-off, we can just buy. So it's this changing environment that actually has created this perfect concoction and cocktail for fraud to absolutely rise, because we don't value what it is that we're protecting in the first place. Now, what I try and do, and again, from this point of view, and what I'm working with Dr. Liz Carter from what is going to be Kingston University, she again works in forensic linguistics from a criminology point of view, is I focus on the cognitive heuristics, those mental shortcuts in which people make, and how absolutely ludicrous and irrational creatures that we are, the more I learn about it. But also she comes from the much more the linguistics in which people use in text messages and content and phishing emails and social engineering in order to make us do something that it would objectively not want to do. But I think one of the biggest missing pieces of the puzzle is that relationship with technology in the middle. Because I want to ask you, is that, have you ever taken a text message the wrong way from a partner? Have you ever taken an email the wrong way from a colleague? Is that this case is that we are entirely reliant on subjective forms of communication, even more so in a post-COVID environment. Is that social media, technology, and again, social media does not lead to depression, doesn't lead to anxiety, doesn't lead to vulnerability. But what technology and social media does do is it does reflect our own psychology back to us with interest. It becomes an emotional feedback loop that you only get out what you put in. So again, people will have different motivations, different aspects around this. So what I really concentrate on is that our projected narrative, our vulnerability, the story in which you tell yourself, projects onto technology. You read things in the way you want to read it. You go online to find people who believe in what you believe. If you're just going through a breakup and you're stalking your ex, that self-destructive behavior is part of the narrative in which you're telling yourself. It all extends to this larger aspect and our relationship with this. Because the fact is that let's take a standard run-of-the-mill spam phishing email, HMRC tax rebate scam. Now, all of us, most likely on this call, objectively, would be able to see the red flags of the URL or a link or a dodgy looking picture or something along those lines, or the wording, and we'd be able to check and see those red flags from space. What happens if you've got financial anxiety? What happens if you've got a little bit too much month at the end of your paycheck? And again, money, whether perceived or actual, is that vulnerability, that mental health, the anxiety, the depression, the feeling that you have in the center of your chest. What are you looking for? You're going to see the tax rebate. How much am I going to be owed? Have you ever been in a relationship in the past that you've missed red flags? Of course we have. Most of us have. And then you look back on it, you think, why did I do that? But this is fraud, because you read things in the way you want to read it, and why cyber and social engineering is so more effective in a cyber-enabled fashion, because cyber and fraud very often slips these cognitive gaps in order to make us victims in the first place. Now, on top of that, I want you to think about this, is I'm going to give you a story. A young girl looks in the mirror. She hates what she sees. She can't stand what she sees. Again, things like body dysmorphia, this element of our personal image around ourselves. But now, if that young girl potentially goes online and she wants to find people who believe in what she believes, she finds a community of people who think the way in which she thinks. But now she might post pictures. She might do something online. So her entire narrative will cultivate online in whether it's the normalizing of her behavior or something along those lines. But the fact is, if somebody comes out of the woodwork and says, you know what, I think you're beautiful, I think you're incredible, and this gentleman comes out of the woodwork on social media and says, I'd love to see more of those pictures, I'd love to see more of you, is that now this young girl, we now all feel really uncomfortable because actually this man has more power, a lot of power over this person. Now, the thing is you have this mutual projection, don't you? You have the person that is changing the narrative in order to meet it, but also the story in which she's telling herself about her situation and what her belief about herself, and whether it's anxiety and mental health, is then projected on everything she reads. And now we wonder why grooming happens and why grooming is so effective. Now, if you then say, right, if I say to you, grooming, sexual exploitation, terrorism, vandalism, drugs, crime, assault, burglary, if I say all these words out to you, you have an emotional hook. But if I say fraud to you, you don't have one. And that's the problem, is that cyber and fraud, and from a social engineering point of view, because of the relationship we have with technology, is not an emotional problem. And if you don't have an emotional problem, then you don't see the risk. You're not motivated to protect yourself in the first place. So we all have this narrative. We all have this story in which we tell yourselves. Like me, if you've ever suffered from depression or anxiety, you know how pivotal that story you tell yourself at any point is to your overall well-being. But that's the thing, is that social engineering, in pretty much every aspect, we are told to trust our gut. But our gut is entirely subjective and absolutely rubbish. Intuition isn't magic. It's our experiences projected depending on the context and how we feel about ourselves. And that's where it comes from, is that this narrative also ties into the fact that actually, although cyber and fraud, again, from a social engineering point of view, I want to catch you, and that's exactly what I want to do. I want you to trust your gut by clicking on this link and going through to whether it's malware, whether it's an email, whether it's a phishing website, whatever it is, that's exactly what I'm reliant on you doing. Because you're doing the school run, you're putting the kids to bed, you're cooking dinner, you're doing something along those lines. The parcel scam that comes through, it's not the first thought you have is scam. No, what did I order? And what on earth have I drunkenly ordered on Amazon? Or something along those lines. Is that's the key around social engineering, because it's an emotional problem that isn't regarded as one. So when we extend this, it also cultivates into the way we perceive risk as human beings. And again, more and more I discover about this, the more arbitrary and ridiculous that is. Because let's take air travel, for instance. If, for instance, some of us on this call, some of you out there will be absolutely petrified of getting on a plane. Now, even those that are completely fine with getting on a plane and flying, etc., to whatever destination you're doing, is that you will read that card, that laminated card in the seat in front of you. You'll listen to the safety briefing. You may even feel around for the life jacket. You may look for the oxygen masks or something along those lines in order to ensure that you are safe in case the event does happen. Now, why? Why is it that we are so motivated to educate and to protect ourselves from this fact? Well, because you have a really emotional, visceral, and integral image and representation of what can happen to you going hundreds of miles an hour in a steel and aluminium tube. Thank the amount of 1990s action movies and the media to be able to give you that image. But statistically, if I told you that actually it's much more likely that you die horribly on the way to the airport than ever up in the air, would that change your fear of flying, or would that change your, or that make you more scared of cars? No, because statistics, again, what's the main thing we focus on around education for cyber and fraud? Yes, statistics. Since when has a statistic ever changed your perception of a risk or a problem? Oh, that's a terrible statistic. But unfortunately, and again, I think this is incredibly inappropriate to quote Stalin, but but the fact is, when he does talk about the death of one is a tragedy versus a death of a million is a statistic, is that yes, very different context as to why he said it, but the fact is it's very true, is because it's not an emotional issue. I cannot quantify or understand the probability of me being a victim of fraud as opposed to terrorism, because terrorism is an emotional problem. But guess what? More likely that you'll be struck by lightning than being a victim of a terrorist attack. But everybody is motivated to protect themselves from it, as opposed to fraud and cyber, which is pretty much statistically the most likely crime that you will ever be a victim of. And this is where we expect this magical cliff edge moment where the public and our staff in our organizations, our businesses across the board, this magical cliff edge moment when the public just get it, that this is an issue and I need to be motivated to protect myself and take action in order to do it. It's never going to happen in the way we do it. And that's the problem, because we are not actually thinking about how people learn or motivated, see value, and therefore also see and quantify and understand risk, which again, absolutely arbitrary. So for instance, again, like the idea around air travel, terrorism, other types of crime, is that Daniel Kahneman, again, talks about in Thinking Fast and Slow, and the Israeli psychologist, he talks about the availability heuristic. Sunstein did a lot of work around this as well, is that this cognitive heuristic, or the availability heuristic, or this mental shortcut in which we use, is that you assess the importance, the probability, or the risk of something based on the ease of which something comes to mind, whether that be an image, a case study, or an example. Is that air travel, you have a really good example and an image in your head in order to represent that. A pileup on the M25 does not make a good news story, nor does it make a particularly interesting Fast and the Furious film. So do you have an image of what that will look like? No. So how do you assess the risk? Well, you assess the risk based on the ease of which something came to mind. If I say to you terrorism, it's exactly the same thing. But if I say to you fraud, it's not that easy. And that quantifies and contributes to the fact that actually we are trying to educate people with the assumption that they care about it. But they don't. And that's from a general public point of view, but also from a cyber. And again, the difference is from an education point of view between fraud and cyber, as you well know, it's all social engineering. In whatever packaging or flavor that you want to do it, it's all social engineering. The tools may differ, but the education is entirely arbitrary between the two. Because again, 87% of fraud is cyber enabled and rising because it's a lot easier to do. So again, it's all this perception of risk of why we're trying to educate the public and how do we make it an emotional problem. Because what we want is people to have an intuitive response to fraud, to cyber, to social engineering, an intuitive response to see that phishing email, to see that smishing text, to get that phone call that's offering us a once in a lifetime investment or something along those lines. And we want an intuitive response to go, this feels odd to me. And that's what we ultimately want. But the problem is that that intuition really only ever comes from recognition, from the experience. So when we talk about fraud and cyber, we're very keen to talk about the new trends. But we're constantly talking about the new trends, especially fraud, especially social engineering, etc. Always like, let's talk about the new trends, what's coming out now, that's fantastic, excellent. But the issue with that is that we're constantly moving the goalposts from what people need to identify. So whether it's a Royal Mail scam, whether it's a social engineering scam, whether it's a spear phishing campaign against a business or an organization or the military or whatever it is, we're constantly vigilant towards the new trends, to what to look out for. The issue with that is that by the time we're actually educating against that trend, it's moved on to the next one. So we're always playing catch up. Now, with that intuition and that understanding of intuition, is that how do we get that? Is that, well, this is where the education and the way in which we prevent, where we design internal e-learning platforms, again, from a cybercrime point of view, from an education point of view, 9 times out of 10, it's an audit job. It's e-learning because there's a spreadsheet within my organization that I need to tick a box, because that is probably what has been the biggest mover towards businesses being motivated to protect themselves from cybercrime, not the emotional impact on the customers that trust them with their data, not the fact that actually the response to ransomware or the idea or the principle of their business being completely crippled overnight by malware, but because suppliers and organizations have needed it as assurance. It's not because it's an emotional problem, not because they have been able to quantify the actual risk, but because of that weight from a spreadsheet point of view and an audit point of view. So again, I'm very cynical. I apologize for this, but this is it. Is that from an internal tonality point of view, we need to gain this intuitive response as opposed to, well, educating it and just ticking some sort of box. Because if we look at social engineering, and again, whatever capacity we look at, is that you don't automatically read it that it's a scam. It's not always, again, depending on your education, depending on how bad the phishing email is that very often we make assessments very, very quickly. And what, again, Daniel Kahneman talks about is the causality bias, is that we essentially see and put together cause as easy as we do color. So again, the parcel scam that comes through, the smishing text, the email that comes through, is that you build a story around the context of the text or the information quicker than you can identify that it's a scam. The problem is with the causality bias is that we're also hardwired to believe the story in which we create, as opposed to objective reality. Again, very good. Other example, online dating. If you've ever done online dating, how quickly can you build a story and a cause and an image around somebody, then you go on a date with them and then you realize, actually, they're not at all what I expected. Well, of course they're not, because you're the one that created the story based on 3 images and an evening of text messages. So it's this ability and this subjective communication really ties into this relationship and our susceptibility to manipulation and grooming, because, again, using things like the causality bias, we read things in the way we want to read it, and based on our experiences. Why do parcel scams really come around in Christmas or just in the run up to Christmas? Well, criminals know this because actually you're going to get 5 or 6 text messages over the course of that week or the couple of weeks beforehand in order to be able to do it. I'm relying on you literally just clicking a button and filling in a data or all these sorts of things. So again, looking at that, fraud is a symptom of this larger problem. And again, we can talk about digital well-being. We can talk about the psychology of technology and all this relationship that we have and how the changing of our relationships. Because actually, and so often when I talk about romance fraud, is that we actually, we haven't created technology in order to meet the way we have relationships. We've changed ourselves in order to meet it. And if you think about that in the space of a decade and a half, that has also changed the way in which we are groomed and manipulated, and we see things for not necessarily for what they are. I'll skip over that one. So how do I do it? How do I create this world for you? Because actually, from a manipulation and grooming point of view, I just have to sow the seed. I can send that email. Most fraudsters, from a smishing point of view, from a phishing point of view, and spear phishing point of view, all I have to do, I don't have to make it good. I just have to make it passable. Because if you're sat there objectively looking at it with a real keen eye, you're going to spot my email. So it doesn't have to be good because I want you to be doing other things. And also from aspect of, right, I want to have an element of compliance. I want to convince you and use your gut against you in order for you to continue to make those decisions. Why do car salesmen, for instance, not want you to leave the showroom before you've made a decision? It's because you see the nice shiny car, I really want to buy it, there's a hole burning in my pocket, and if I leave, I'm going to be somewhat more objective. Now, the issue now is because of the changing customer experience, the ability for us to access data, to compromise systems, to transfer funds via our online banking app to some sort of entity, etc., is that now all of a sudden there is no delay. We can't do the metaphorical go home and have a think about it and look at our budget before we then make the decision with the fraud. No, because fraudsters can keep us in that limited emotional window in order to make us compliant, to adjust our decision making. Again, are you thinking rationally when you are thinking emotionally? No. So it's this element where this kind of perfect melting pot of both how customer experience, user-friendly aspects of our technology has also made us more vulnerable by extension, because we don't value what we're protecting. We don't see the risk in the first place because we're psychologically have no ability to do so. And on top of this is that we're not motivated to protect ourselves in the first place, and criminals can keep us in this emotional window until we realize it's too late. Fascinates me when people say, I can't believe they now have an emotional response because they're now a victim of a fraud. They're now a victim of a cybercrime. I can't believe they clicked on that link and saw that malware. Well, if you're now working remotely, as you've got a partner that's maybe redundant during COVID, you've got children running around, you now that professional and personal lines are completely blurred now. You thought they were bad before COVID. Now they don't exist. So now is that your emotional life is entirely integral with your professional life. So all this kind of integration has changed the game, whether it's insider fraud, whether it's in social engineering, whether it's malware, whether it's that susceptibility and vulnerability to that process in its entirety. But I'll also give you an example. And this is another, by the way in which we educate, for instance, and the way we put out education from a prevention point of view, whether it's businesses, whether it's banks, whether it's law enforcement, is that it comes down to a choice. Because if I say to you, right, I'm going to give you two choices. I'm going to go I'm going to give you £500 versus B, 50% chance at £1,000. Now, pretty much most people will go, well, probably 80-something% of people will choose A. You just have to watch Who Wants to Be a Millionaire or a game show to know that people will want to walk away with something as opposed to nothing. Because B is a flip of a coin, isn't it? A flip of a coin, whether you walk away with nothing or you walk away with £1,000. Now, the gamblers amongst you will most likely go for B. You're like, you know what? I'm going to take that chance and I'm going to go for £1,000. But for the gamblers amongst you, if I added a 0 to each of those numbers, would your choice change? Possibly. Now, if I flip it over, and really laboring the coin analogy, is that A, £500. I'm going to take it from you. Definitely going to take £500 from you. Versus B, 50% chance that I take £1,000 from you. Now, almost universally, people switch to B because there's 50% chance that I'll lose 1,000, but it's also 50% chance I lose nothing. Now, this is called prospect theory. Now, why I apply this to cybercrime and fraud is because if I frame something positively to you, you become risk averse. If I frame something negatively to you, you become risk taking. What tone do we have for every single piece of education in relation to cybercrime and fraud? If you don't do X and Y, Z's really bad. It's normally written by cybercrime professionals and individuals because we know the risk. We see it every day. We are constantly exposed to the risk. We know it's an issue, and we are desperate for people to understand that it's an issue in the first place. But that's not going to happen. So what we do is we frame something negatively. We give the warnings. And all this framing creates the fact that actually, well, you're asking me to protect something that I don't value. Again, risk, for instance, I don't see the risk. I can't quantify the risk and over that principle. But on that basis, is it from a children point of view? Again, parents on this call, parents out there, what works better? If you don't behave, I'm going to take these toys from you, versus B, if we actually go, if you behave, we're going to go and have something nice to eat and you're going to have some sweets, or you're going to go to the toy shop. Generally speaking, it's the latter. Again, not a parent, but I'm pretty sure that's a positive incentive, so to speak. And our psychology is no different, because what we need to do is we need to really think of the aspirational and emotional problem as to how we educate. For instance, passwords. Even bane of most of our existences, and one of the biggest singular issues around cybercrime fraud and why data is so abundant, how people get compromised. Fine. But if I say to you, well, actually, if I swapped your front door key with a password, would you remember it? Of course you would, because you inherently understand and value what it is the password is protecting. On top of that, I then tell you that that password is now being breached. It's now open. It's now been hacked as a result of data breach, and everybody knows where you live. How quickly would you change said password? Like, you would stop this call immediately and go and change it. But again, I would also ask you, would you reuse that password anywhere? Would you reuse it on your car or your garage door or your allotment shed or something? No, I wouldn't. Well, because you inherently value what it is that the authentication and security is protecting. We don't online, because we are further detached from what we're supposed to value. Therefore, do not see risk. Therefore, do not understand the value of the security in the first place. So it all comes down to this myriad of how we go about it. But from an education point of view, this fraud especially, and cyber to a certain extent from a social engineering point of view and an internal culture point of view, you would never, ever tell somebody that they fell for domestic violence. You would never, ever tell somebody that they fell for that assault, for that burglary, for that robbery, for that any of these emotional crimes that I listed right at the beginning. You would never, ever tell them that they fell for it. But that's exactly what we do in social engineering and fraud. The whole language in which we use is not necessarily useful, because what is the number one coping mechanism for somebody who has damaged their business as a result of clicking on a link, who has lost thousands upon hundreds of thousands as a result of an investment fraud or some sort of scam? Self-abuse. And why does that self-abuse come out? Because the entire language is cultivated to make sure that you feel shame when you're a victim. And that's the problem. That really comes down to the fact of around that psychology of prevention, because we are trying to educate with the assumption that people see it as a risk in the first place, but we're also waiting for that magical cliff edge moment when the customers and the public just get it. And this is where, again, hopefully, fingers crossed, I start my PhD in September on this problem to try and actually tease out, well, what's the alternative? I don't necessarily know the answer, but I do have a pretty good idea what the problem is. So again, I guess that's always the issue. But when we're trying to reinvent this wheel constantly each year in relation to understanding the new trends, the new types, etc. But when it comes down to the fact that actually 98% of all cybercrime and fraud is social engineering, it's manipulation, the context, the authority, the urgency, the scarcity, and most importantly, it's the emotion. Again, when I've done red teaming for businesses and organizations and targeted businesses, what do? Well, actually, I'm not going to try and hack you. I'm not going to try and break into your systems. Well, actually, I'm going to try and pick on someone. And again, if I send you an email on a Friday afternoon just before payday or the day before payday, and I say, hello, I'm from HR, there's a problem with your payback, can you put in your details, etc., just put it onto this link, and then we'll make sure that you get paid. Nobody is going on their weekend without clicking on that link and filling in that form. So it's this element of how do I trigger emotion? The criminals get that. The criminals fully, I know it's probably an unpopular aspect, but from a criminal's point of view, if it wasn't so insidious, I'd actually respect them because of their ability to pivot and understand what it is that exploits us. But the fact is, from an emotional point of view, is that they understand that emotional hook, but we have seemingly forgotten it because we use it in every other aspect. We use it in sales and marketing. And what is crime prevention? Crime prevention and cybercrime prevention, and a much larger aspect from a crime prevention point of view, is it's sales and marketing, but we don't have the profit to tell us whether we're doing it any well or any good. It's terrible English, but you get what I mean. But that's the thing. Instead of actually understanding of how do we educate the customers more consistently around the key factors that they're looking out for, regardless of the trend. Because these haven't changed for thousands of years. Our psychology moves far, far slower than the last 14 years of cyber-enabled crime and fraud and this kind of exploitation. So where do we focus our efforts in that respect? But also, again, if any of you have ever studied any elements of criminology, is that we now start to understand why it's so much easier to get into. Because if you see the criminology diamond aspect, again, from a very simplistic understanding, I don't come from a criminology background, but what I do see is that this combination of things for me to burgle your house, for instance. Now I need an opportunity. Is your window slightly ajar? Is that fence panel or is that gate open, for instance, that I can get into? Capability, do I have the strength to be able to open that window or jimmy that lock or jump over the fence? Or do I have the cardio in order to run away? But also the pressure. Well, I need to put myself in danger, like objective danger, in order to enact that crime. So the pressure could be quite, whether perceived or actual, could be quite considerable in order for me to enact that crime. But also what we forget is that criminals need to rationalize, is that they need to be able to sleep at night, because if they don't, then they wouldn't make particularly good criminals. But when we look at this from a traditional crime and all those different crime types with those emotional hooks that we have at the beginning of the presentation, if we overlay technology on this, all of the requirements for every single factor is reduced. Opportunity, do you have an internet connection? Capability, well, we all say that cybercrime and fraud is becoming more sophisticated. Yeah, but I would argue probably the tools are, but actually the capability in order to get involved in it, especially fraud, is actually lowering. Because actually I don't need that much capability. I don't need the cardio to be able to run away from that house once I've burgled it. But also the pressure, because those other factors are reduced, well, I just need a new pair of trainers. That doesn't have to be great. It doesn't have to be perceived or actual. It doesn't have to be much pressure whatsoever. It can just be because I want to. The majority of this investigation, etc., and from a investigation, from a smishing point of view, again, it's becoming this kind of gateway crime, especially in low-level fraud. But also they need to rationalize. But the very fact that I am detached from my victim, I am detached from the people in which I am harming so far away, is that it's so much easier for me to rationalize. And this concoction then leads into this relationship that we have with technology. Because what do? We place all of our baggage on our technology. Is that we, in every possible conversation we have, and all these things that we've talked about so far, is that we forget our relationship with this. We forget our relationship and how we have changed our lives to fit it, as opposed to adapting technology in order to fit us. So what we do is we project our own vulnerability, our baggage, everything that we believe about ourselves becomes in that emotional feedback loop. And again, we've just passed Valentine's Day. We're talking about press releases around romance fraud. Well, that's the thing, is that we are experiencing, I think it's Dr. Michelle Drouin that talks about the fact that actually we are experiencing an intimacy famine because of our relationship with technology and our distancing from each other, is that I wouldn't necessarily disagree with her. So why has romance fraud increased 38% over COVID? It's because people are lonely, people are detached, all these sorts of things that come with this. So it becomes much more of a symptom of another problem. So this domino effect is that you can now go online without any sort of objective feedback to say, you know what you're believing about yourself is not correct. Well, actually, have you thought about who this person is? Have you thought about clicking on that link? Because again, they might have just sent something in WhatsApp or something along those lines, and this domino effect ends up just taking you away. Because from a terrorism point of view, that's how radicalization has happened. Is that now I don't have to travel to theatre. I don't have to travel out there. All I need is isolation and a laptop in order to normalize my behavior and my thinking. And that's either positive or it's negative. So that domino effect is very, very effective when we're talking about this relationship that we have with technology and the people who's the ability could change their narrative and their entire conversation with you in order to keep that domino effect going. But to finish, before we have questions as well, is that think about the habit. Like when the next time you pick up your phone, I want you to ask yourself why you picked it up. Because on top of this is that we have so much of our habits within our technology and our devices, is that when we talk about the psychological effect of what's called propinquity, is that the someone or something that is closest to you most consistently has the greatest psychological effect on you at any time. Now, if you go back more than 14 years, you would have probably argued that it was people. Your family, your friends, your children, your partner, whoever it was, would have the greatest psychological impact on you. Would you say it's people anymore? No. So when somebody is trying to groom you, whether it's over a couple of minutes, whether it's a couple of years, whether it's a couple of months, is that think about the power that this person has over you in whatever context, mixed in with our habits, that when we pick up our phone and we look at our phone, etc., is that this, again, this is not a problem in isolation, but a larger aspect around how we actually deal with technology and our relationship with it across the board as well. So that is me. So today is very much around those food for thought and to question the way in which we do things. So please, if we do have time, I'm more than happy to take any questions as well. So thank you very much, everybody. Anybody?